thank you, Dominic, very much for having me. I always enjoy being able to come back to this seminar, and it's always a place where I get really terrific questions and ideas for future work. And so your previous colleagues have set the bar high, and I'm very excited to have a chance to talk with you all today and see some familiar faces from some seminars of mine past. So I'm really thrilled to share this. This is a new project that I've been working on for a few months now. It builds off of something that I relatively recently published that actually might be of interest to some science communicators. So what it builds off of is a project that did a survey experiment of journalists to ask them about how they would report on a new scientific discovery. And so in this case it was a discovery about that was related to a new technology. And so imagine that this new app becomes available, and that encouraging particular communication styles on the app makes people more likely to engage in pro-social behaviors and following doctor's orders and things like that. And so we varied various aspects of the elements of the app and the elements of the results, and asked journalists whether they would do a hard news story, a feature news story, whether they thought it should be a long or a short story, whether they would read the research that the article came from or not before they did their work, that sort of thing. This one's more political in nature, but it kind of builds off that same idea of trying to actually understand what journalists do. And the motivation for this is that we know a lot about the audience. Most political communication research and most media effects research, quite rightly focuses on how people or groups of people or large masses of people react to different kinds of communication messages, or different communication mediums, or different modes of communication or interactions of those in one-shot, multiple-shot experiments, or over time with single-shot surveys or panel surveys. So we know a lot about people. We know that individuals tend to judge the media as being biased. We know that people who really care about politics tend to think that the news media are especially biased against that individual's particular point of view. Even if we show the exact same story to strong liberals and strong conservatives tend to believe the article is liberally biased. Strong liberals tend to believe that exact same article was conservatively biased. We call this the hostile media effect. This frustrates journalists to no end, who think no matter what I do, you're going to think that what I'm doing is a lousy job of reporting. We know that, so we know the hostile media effect exists. We're learning more and more about misperceptions and how difficult those are to overcome when people believe things that aren't true. And reporters do the job of reporting the verifiable truth, suggesting to individuals that what they believe might be wrong. And we know that when that happens, often people double down on their incorrect view and hold it with even greater confidence than they did before. We also know that under some conditions, people are likely to actually accept facts that push against what it is they believe. But those conditions are much more difficult to come by. So we have a great sense of how this operates, I think, within the public. We know far less about what actually produced that. We know much more about the audience and far less about the stage. And usually people go to a play to see what's on the stage, not think about the audience's reactions. And so one thing I'm really interested in is how journalists themselves choose to cover stories. And I'm also interested in journalists' own perceptions of the work of their colleagues. So if we think about the hostile media effect, this is an effect where people who really care about politics or really care about a particular set of issues are likely to believe that a story is biased against their point of view. The knock on journalists by many people who claim media bias are that journalists are a bunch of liberals, and therefore they will cover politics in a way that favors their point of view. The claim journalists are a bunch of liberals has the virtue of being false. We know from David Weaver and Cleveland Wilhoit's work every decade for the last 4, I think, of doing a survey of journalists around the country and in the last iteration around the world, asking journalists about their own self-reported ideology. There are more liberals than there are conservatives, but the disparity is actually getting smaller, and journalists tend to be more often than not refer to themselves as moderates. And so the idea that journalists are all a bunch of liberals and are in some kind of organized cabal or unorganized cabal to report the news in a liberally biased way needs more evidence than just the self-reported ideology of journalists, as there's greater variance there than we might otherwise think. But if it's the case that strong liberals and strong conservatives are susceptible to the hostile media effect, maybe journalists are just as susceptible to that problem, even though they themselves are professionals producing this work. And so this is kind of the broad area of interest that I want to talk about today. But before we get into the study itself, I just kind of wanted to set a picture of what the world looks like from which I enter this particular project. So one way of thinking about this is looking at broad questions of Americans' trust in the mass media. This data comes from the Gallup organization. This starts in 1997 and ends in 2016. Just asking whether you think that you can trust news media reporting. Is it can you trust them to report accurately, fairly, a great deal of time, a fair amount of time, none, not very much. And if we aggregate together a great deal of time and a fair amount of time, we were over 50% in 1997, and if we had backed this up with American National Election Study data from the 80s and 70s, it was even higher, the trust in the media, and now down to 32%, closer to present day. So a fairly substantial and fairly linear drop. And actually, if we, this board extended and this data extended further, we would see that it was even higher a couple of decades ago. So a deep distrust of the work that the news media do. That trust is stronger on the right. So the lower kind of, I'm not sure what color that is, orangish, bronzish, I don't know, brown, I don't know. But the people who distrust news media, so liberals are more likely to trust, conservatives are more likely to distrust the news media. And a fair number of people aren't aware and just don't tend to think about it. Do not wake up, clap their hands and say, how shall I hold my government accountable today via my vigorous consumption of the news? Many people don't do that, as we know. We also know that when there is coverage, it tends to be negative. This comes from the Shorenstein Center, Tom Patterson, who did some work on the 2016 presidential election, and just looking at the general election and the full campaign, negative stories outweighed positive stories for both candidates. This is not atypical. This is the usual in terms of how news reporting works. And so journalists are less trusted. They tend to focus on the negative, and they do so in an environment that is increasingly polarized at both the federal and state levels. And so here we're looking at data from Keith Poole, Howard Rosenthal, and Nolan McCarty. If you really can't sleep one night or love animated graphics of voter behavior and lawmaker behavior from the beginning of this country to present day, go to voteview.org and watch all of these great pictures they have. But the top figure here is looking at the polarization between the two political parties in the House and in the Senate from 1879, so about a decade and a half after the Civil War, all the way to the end of the last congressional session. We can see that we are now more polarized in the House and in the Senate than we were just a few years after the Civil War. So 15 years after we were literally killing each other for 4 years, we were less divided in the voting behavior of Republicans and Democrats than we are now. So there's a deeply polarized environment. And the two parties have become much more homogenous within their parties as the distance between them has increased. And so you can see that during the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, there was a pronounced difference between Southern Democrats who were elected officials and Democrats of other parts of the country. Most of this difference was kind of soaked up in variance over their support or lack of support for various kinds of civil rights legislation. But now there's virtually no difference between Democrats from the South, from the North, or anywhere else in the country. They behave much more like Republicans in terms of their own internal party discipline in their votes. And so we have a deeply polarized set of lawmakers from which journalists have to choose from when they're covering American politics at the federal level. So we have low trust in journalism. People think the media are biased, and it's an incredibly polarized environment. How do journalists navigate this environment to figure out what to cover and how to judge all the other stuff that they see from their competitors in terms of what those folks are covering? And if you say, there's, maybe 6 or 7 billion people on the planet, and if charitably 3 things happen to you every day, and you're in 2 groups where one more thing happens every day, you've got 30 billion potential stories for the news media cover. On average, 8 get on the front page of the New York Times. All of the words that are said tonight on the NBC Nightly News would fit on the front page of the New York Times, and there'd still be room for a big photograph. And so how do journalists navigate everything that's out there to 8 things? for the front page, or a set of things to cover on local television or national news. That's one of the broad questions I want to ask today. So what do journalists find newsworthy? And then once they see coverage that they did not produce, what are the elements of news coverage that journalists perceive as being biased? So those are kind of the two questions I want to ask today. And to get into that, I build on some different perspectives in political science, political communication, and mass communication studies that look at a few different concepts that I'll talk about very briefly, one of which is called issue ownership. This originated with John Petrosik in the 1980s. A slew of other folks continue to study this as well. And the broad idea is that the public believes that some parties are better at handling a particular problem than another party. And so, so step one is understanding public perceptions of which party is better equipped to handle a problem. And then, when voters are thinking about that particular issue, when they vote, they're more likely to vote for the party who owns the issue. Which suggests that if you're a candidate running for office, you want your party's own issues to be in the news. So the voters are considering you and your opponent on an issue where they evaluate your side more favorably. So typically, we think of issues such as crime and taxes and national defense as being issues that are owned by the Republican Party. When candidates run on those sorts of issues as Republicans, they tend to be more favorably evaluated by the public, and to the extent that they can choose to advertise on those issues and get those issues covered by the news media, they tend to perform a little better at the ballot box. Democrats tend to be perceived as owning healthcare, education, Social Security, among other issues, and so when they run for office, they tend to try to focus on those issues. It's very difficult for parties to steal issues. When a candidate tries to campaign on an issue the other side owns, it's very difficult. You can think to, or maybe if you're kind of a politics nerd, you can think about the 2004 presidential election where Senator John Kerry ran against President George W. Bush, who was running for re-election. Senator Kerry had served in Vietnam, was a decorated war veteran, and ran hard on his ability to stop terrorism, his beliefs that President Bush was not doing a good job of prosecuting the war in Iraq, and saying he could do a better job on issues of defense. And that strategy did not persuade most voters. Even though President Bush had limited experience in the National Guard and did not have the service record that Senator Kerry had, President Bush and his supporters aired ads beefing up President Bush's kind of positions on those sorts of issues and attacked Senator Kerry's record on those issues as well. If you've heard of swift voting, there was a small number of ads aired in a small number of places that deeply criticized John Kerry's war record in Vietnam, and they barely aired anywhere, but they aired on the news for a long time. And so many people saw them even though they didn't see them as an actual political ad. But the idea was Kerry tried to steal an issue that is typically on the other side, and he failed. And so one thing that we have an idea of is that people perceive the party to be better able to handle problems. Journalists, we know from Wolfgang Dansbach's work, care deeply about perceptions of reality when they're going to do their own work. And we know from kind of more sociological and popular accounts of journalism, for example, Timothy Krause's The Voice on the Bus or Herbert Gans's Deciding What's News, journalists often rely on each other to understand what the public perception is about an issue, and they tend to report major political issues in packs, so coverage looks similar across different outlets because journalists often fear their editor or producer saying to them, why is your story different than everybody else's? And you would think a reporter might say, isn't it good that my story's the one that's unique? But there's a lot of internal pressure to conform to what the narrative is about a particular issue. And so journalists ought to care about, I think, perceptions of issue ownership when they're deciding whether to cover a story and how to cover it. So I've already talked a bit about the hostile media perception, so I'll skip over that just for the sake of time and say the other thing that I think we've understudied in our examination of how journalists decide what's news is their search for what's novel. We know from more sociological accounts of deciding what's news, of course, an element of newsworthiness is something that's novel, something that's new, something that causes conflict. And one way we can kind of operationalize that more formally is to think about what economists and others call cheap talk versus costly talk. So cheap talk is when someone says what you expect them to say. Right? When a Democrat says, I'm going to oppose all of President Trump's cabinet nominees because they are terrible and they believe things that are terrible for America. And cheap talk is a Republican saying, I'm voting for all of these nominees because a Republican president nominated them, and damn it, I'm a Republican too, and it's time to have our team having the keys to the car. So cheap talk would be making arguments that you would expect folks to make. A Republican saying abortion is murder, a Democrat saying abortion is a woman's choice. That's cheap talk. Costly talk is when these same partisans say things that you wouldn't expect them to say, and they say something that might actually have the effect of harming them within their own in-group. So a Democrat's saying, you know what, I'm going to vote for Jeff Sessions today, and to confirm him as Attorney General. And the reason I'm going to do that is I think that he has a keen legal mind and is going to care deeply about the issues that I want him to care about, from civil rights to caring for the disabled to issues of privacy. If a Democrat says that, that's going to probably be on the news because we don't expect a Democrat to say that. And so I want to kind of keep these ideas in mind. Perceptions of who owns what issue, and especially parties engaging in cheap or costly talk. So what I did was I made a list of the top 150 media markets in the United States, located all of the local television stations and newspapers within those media markets, and then had a series of unfortunate graduate students go through all of those markets, look at every single local television news site, every single newspaper, and find out who wrote a political story on either the previous Sunday, Tuesday, or Thursday, which are the 3 days that political news is the most likely to appear in both television and newspaper coverage. And so I had a list of a couple thousand, about 6,300, I guess, in the end, of journalists around the country who had written a story about politics fairly recently. And then I took a random sample of 2,000 from that population and contacted them via email, offered them a Starbucks gift card for participating in a little survey experiment, and sent them on their way. Out of those 2,631 responded to the survey, and about 40% of those self-identified as liberal, 27% as conservative, and the rest, about just north of 30%, identified as a moderate. So we had, so this number is fairly similar to the numbers that Weaver and Beam got in their last decennial survey of American journalists. So either we're both wrong together, or we should both feel better about our data. So then reporters got a story about one of two particular issues. One issue was about the healthcare mandate as prescribed by the Affordable Care Act, and one story was about a proposed tax on medical devices. So Democrats tend to own healthcare issues, and so the mandate ought to be an issue that journalists perceive as being more identified with Democrats. Republicans tend to own issues of taxes, and so I use that as a proxy for issues that would be more likely to be owned by Republicans. I asked the journalists a set of questions about their perceptions about what do your readers or viewers think about which party can handle this issue better, and asked about 15 different issues. I embedded these both in there, and sure enough, when it came to the device tax, journalists are more likely to say that they thought their readers or viewers would say that Republicans dealt with that better, and the same with the mandate, they thought Democrats would deal with that better. So a little bit of validity with respect to my categorizing those as owned issues. They are both healthcare related issues, and so that's a problem. So I'm following up a study where I'm doing two different kinds of defense issues, one dealing more with civil liberties, which Democrats tend to get higher marks on, and one more about protecting from terrorism, which Republicans tend to get higher marks on, and then one that's not associated with either party. And so those are issues to try to see if this was an artifact of these two particular issues. So then, they either write a balanced story more or less about mandated healthcare mandate or a proposed device tax. One story was where Democrats and Republicans quoted in the story both engaged in cheap talk. So 2 Democratic senators were quoted, both supported the mandate as part of the Affordable Care Act. 2 Republican senators were quoted, they both opposed the mandate. the Affordable Care Act. The quotes were, when you added both quotes together with the same number of words, using a database called the ANEW database, which ANEW is an acronym that stands for Affective Norms of English Words. It's a database that scores how extreme or moderate words are and whether those are positive or negative. The ANEW scores were similar across both quotes, so it was as balanced as the story could possibly be in terms of the way the journalist told the story. The other conditions had 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans engage in cheap talk, and then it varied, or had 1 Democrat and 1 Republican, I should say, engage in the same cheap talk as in this condition. But then in this next condition, one of the both Democrats would engage in cheap talk, and then one of the Republicans, I inserted a costly talk quote, which is to say a quote that pushed against Republicans' views on the mandate or against Republicans' views on increasing taxes on medical devices. To make the story balanced, I added another quote from an expert who said the other cheap talk quote from that condition. So the words were still all in there, and so the number of arguments were still balanced. But in this case, one Republican went off went out of the playbook and said something different. And then the exact same thing in the other direction for the final condition. Both Republicans engage in cheap talk, one Democrat does, and the other Democrat engages in costly talk. So just asking journalists afterwards on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is not newsworthy and 7 is extremely newsworthy, how newsworthy do you think these stories are? The story about the healthcare mandate cheap talk was barely above the midpoint of being more newsworthy than not. The tax cheap talk story was believed to be a little bit more newsworthy. This actually is a significant difference between these 2 particular issues. One thing I did after the survey was ask journalists to write kind of long form. I asked a few questions for them to write, and one thing that came out in my asking them about their perceptions about these issues was some journalists felt that the mandate is old news, and so it's not a huge difference. But I think the reason was that the tax was something a little bit newer, and so I think that probably explains some of that. But in both cases, where the costly talk existed, journalists across the board found those stories to be more newsworthy. So when somebody said something that was not consistent with what the journalists expected, and was not consistent with what that particular lawmaker's party supported, they found that issue to be more newsworthy. So I wanted to break down to see, well, were there differences between liberals and conservatives in terms of judging the newsworthiness of the story? And by and large, there weren't. Right? So when the Republican engages in costly talk here, or the Democrat engages in costly talk here on the mandate story, the darkest bar are liberal journalists, the middle bar are conservative journalists, the far right bar, and each of these are journalists who were moderate, who were at the midpoint on a 7-point ideological self-identified scale. And there were not differences. So liberals and conservatives did not see differences there. And when it came to the costly talk on the medical device, the same thing was broadly true. And even here, the difference between liberals and conservatives was not statistically significant, although they're a little bit far apart in terms of their average rating of newsworthiness. But so no statistical differences amongst any groups within each of these categories. So reporters see costly talk, reporters believe that's newsworthy across the ideological spectrum. And so I wanted to ask if they felt that these stories that they read were not just newsworthy, but biased in one direction or another, favoring liberals or favoring conservatives. Now, we have some reason to believe a priori that journalists who strongly identify as liberals or conservatives will find stories to be biased under some conditions and not others. So this work actually comes from research on judges, or about judges, but on law students, from a scholar named Eileen Brayman, who's in Indiana. And so she did this really nifty experiment of law students, where what she wanted to know was, so what I want to know is, do journalists think stories are biased if they go against the journalist's own particular point of view? And what Eileen wanted to know was, do judges make decisions that support their ideology, or do they follow the law when they're trying to apply the law in decisions? And so what she did in her experiment was she gave these different cases to these law students, these third-year law students who are about to go out into the world. They might even have been ones who clerked for judges. I can't remember if that was part of it. But anyway, she showed them some stories where the law was clear. It was unambiguous, and the judge was supposed to make a decision. What would that student judge do? And then in other cases, the law was ambiguous. You know, there was some elements of case law that supported one legal argument, some elements of case law that supported the other. And what she found was when the law was clear, the judges followed the law. And when the law was ambiguous, they decided in a way that was favorable to their own particular ideology. And so I was sort of interested, yeah, come on in, no worries. And so what I was interested in is whether journalists, you know, underwent that same sort of process. And so here, the scale over here now is perceptions of bias, from conservative bias down at here at 1. 4 is neither liberally nor conservatively biased. And 7 is extremely liberally biased. And so here, I found some differences, but most of the action was amongst conservative journalists. So in the mandate condition, there was an effect amongst both liberal and conservative journalists. So one thing to look at here, though, moderates, virtually indistinct from each other in the Republican versus Democratic costly talk condition. But conservative journalists were way more likely to think when the Republican was engaging in costly talk, that story was liberally biased. They're quoting some Republican who's not saying what Republicans believe, and they're doing that because they're being liberally biased. Liberals found that story to be right on the money, right in the middle, neither biased or unbiased. When we flip the condition and have the Democrat give costly talk, liberals were more likely to say this was conservatively biased. Conservatives were just like liberals over here, they thought it was right on the money. This is a great story. You know, it doesn't matter to them that a Democrat is saying Republican things. Of course they are. That's just the sensible thing to say. Whereas the liberal journalists were saying, what the heck? Why are they quoting this Democrat who doesn't believe what Democrats believe? The cheap talk condition, everybody was fine. So one way that journalists are different than regular humans who read the news is that when journalists see stories that meet their expectations about, and their perceptions about politics, they don't find those stories to be biased. You're telling a story that says Republicans believe to the right, Democrats believe to the left. That's what you're supposed to do. Great work. But when they see Democrats engaging in costly talk, I didn't have the same effect in this condition for liberal journalists, but I found the same effect for Republicans in terms of their costly talk. So once again, Republicans found the device tax engaging in costly talk to be liberally biased. Democrats did not find Democrats supporting, Democrats opposing a tax increase as being conservatively biased. They were broadly fine with it. And so, once again, the cheap talk conditions, everybody's more or less agreed that this is a fairly reasonable story. And so there are a couple takeaways here. One is that there's some evidence that across the ideological board, journalists find stories biased when they push back against their own particular ideology, when their side is not making their side's case. When Democrats aren't making the case for Democrats, and one of the two conditions, Democrats thought that was a biased story. In both other conditions, conservatives thought it was a biased story. And so one explanation for this is that conservatives are more likely to see bias in journalism than liberals are. Another explanation is these are both in the healthcare-related field, and so these are already issues that Democrats owned, and so what we really ought to do is look at another set of issues that are more on the Republican side of the ledger and others that have less of an obvious partisan breakout in people's views about them to see whether conservative journalists really are different than liberal journalists in their definitions of bias. They're not different in their perceptions of newsworthiness, but in this particular study they were at least a little different in their perceptions of bias. And so I'll stop there and take questions. I'm happy to talk about anything you want to talk about.
Thank you.